Pope Leo XIV stood at the high window above St. Peter's Square and delivered one sentence that sounded, at first, like another appeal for persecuted Christians. The crowd applauded, the cameras kept rolling, and most journalists moved on without understanding what had just happened. But that sentence had not begun in Rome. It had begun 2 nights earlier, in a remote Christian village where 40 families were expected to be dead before sunrise. 2 minutes before midnight on Friday, the Apostolic Palace was nearly dark. Only 3 windows still glowed above the silent courtyards, and one of them belonged to Pope Leo XIV. He sat at his desk in a white cassock, with an open folder in front of him, surrounded by the stillness of a building that had already gone to sleep. He had not slept properly in 3 nights because he was waiting for a telephone call he believed would come before morning. 8,000 kilometers away, a small chapel stood near the edge of a wide red desert. Its walls were made of mud, its roof was covered with tin, and nothing about it could stop an armed assault. 25 minutes earlier, a barefoot boy had run through the doorway, breathing too quickly to explain what he had seen. He managed only 3 words: "They are coming." Father Jean did not ask who was coming because every village in the region had been waiting for this night for 3 weeks. More than 20 pairs of headlights were moving through the darkness, with trucks carrying approximately 200 armed men, perhaps more. The village contained 40 Christian families and possessed only 3 rifles, several axes, and a handful of farm tools. There was no army nearby, no road out, and no telephone tower within 30 kilometers. The chapel was not a fortress, but it was the only place in the village built from stone, faith, and collective memory. The boy looked at Father Jean and asked what they should do as the headlights continued moving across the desert. Father Jean held his gaze for a moment, then gave him one instruction: pray. Only after that did he turn toward the radio. Father Jean reached for the radio, knowing that the signal might fail before the message left the village. The equipment was old, the transmission was weak, and the nearest telephone tower stood 30 kilometers away. He spoke into the static anyway, sending the warning beyond the chapel, while the armed trucks continued moving through the desert. There was no confirmation that anyone had heard him. The message crossed 2 countries before it reached a bishop in the capital. The bishop understood that there was no time for formal channels, so he contacted a cardinal in Rome. The cardinal carried the warning farther into the Vatican system, where it finally reached the private secretary of Pope Leo XIV. Each transfer consumed minutes the village did not have. At exactly 11:43 at night in Rome, the Pope's secretary reached the door of the papal study. He did not knock or wait for permission, but pushed the door open and entered with the urgency of a man who already knew the consequences of delay. He looked at the Pope and said only 3 words: "Holy Father, now." Pope Leo was already standing. Pope Leo XIV did not call the Secretariat of State. He did not call Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican press office, or the substitute who normally handled urgent affairs moving through the papal administration. Every official channel available to him would have created records, delays, consultations, and questions before anyone acted. The village did not have time for any of them. Instead, the Pope reached for a number he was not supposed to possess. It was a private line connected directly to a presidential palace in West Africa, known only to a small number of people with access far beyond normal diplomatic channels. Pope Leo had made certain that he was one of them. He understood that the usefulness of the number depended on almost no one knowing it existed. 8 weeks earlier, a bishop had entered the papal study for a private meeting and placed a sealed envelope into the Pope's hand. The bishop told him that he might need what was inside, then added that he hoped he never would. Pope Leo accepted the envelope without opening it and placed it where no visitor or official would see it. For 3 weeks, it remained sealed. When the Pope finally opened the envelope, he found the private number inside. He read it until he could repeat every digit from memory, then destroyed the paper by fire. No note remained in a drawer, no copy entered a Vatican file, and no secretary received instructions to preserve it. By the time Father Jean's warning reached Rome, the only surviving record of the number was inside the Pope's mind. Now, with the secretary standing inside the open doorway and the village waiting in darkness, Pope Leo lifted the telephone. The call would bypass every official layer between his desk and the president's office. It could save the families, but it could also expose the Pope to a confrontation with his own diplomatic structure before the morning was over. He dialed anyway. The private line began ringing at 11:53 at night in Rome. An aide answered from the presidential palace without knowing who was calling and assumed the voice belonged to an internal official. Pope Leo XIV gave him 2 words: "Get the president." The aide froze when he recognized the voice, but the Pope cut through the hesitation and ordered him to make the connection immediately. The call went on hold. 43 seconds later, the president was on the line. He was awake, fully dressed, and already sitting in his office because he had been expecting trouble somewhere inside the country. What he had not expected was the Bishop of Rome calling him directly before midnight. Pope Leo identified himself and told the president to listen carefully. He said that approximately 200 armed men were moving in trucks toward a village the president already knew. When the president asked how the Pope had learned this, Leo stopped him before the question could become another delay. He said the source did not matter, because only the president's actions during the next 60 minutes mattered now. The president began listing the obstacles. The army was already stretched, the roads were unsafe, the men in the convoy operated outside official command, and the available intelligence had not been complete. Pope Leo did not interrupt him. He allowed every excuse to enter the silence, then waited until the president had nothing left to add. Only then did the Pope answer. He told the president that 3 nations were watching the village that night and that all 3 would know by morning what he had done or refused to do. "Pick your legacy, Mr. President," he said. "You have 1 hour." Pope Leo ended the call before the president could respond. He returned the receiver to its place, sat down at his desk, and pressed his hands together. He did not pray for the village in that moment. He prayed for the president, because the president was the man who could still lose his soul before dawn. The line went silent inside the presidential office. The president remained standing with the receiver still in his hand, as though the call had not fully ended. His chief of staff watched from the doorway and asked whether the caller had truly been the Pope. The president answered yes, then said the only part that mattered: Pope Leo had given him 1 hour. He crossed the room and stopped at the window. The Capitol below was quiet, with scattered lights running along the avenue, but beyond the dark interior of the country, approximately 200 armed men were still moving toward the village. The president knew about those men. He had not known which village they would strike, but he knew who they were and how they had been allowed to operate. For months, officials around him had offered the same instruction in different words: look away, avoid a confrontation, and let the armed groups handle what the state did not want to claim. He had been told that this was easier, that intervention would expose arrangements better left untouched, and that no pope would ever notice what happened in a village beyond the reach of cameras. Until that night, the calculation had held. The president turned away from the window and ordered his chief of staff to contact the chief of the army immediately. He also demanded an open line to Eastern Command. The chief of staff hesitated and warned that moving forces that night could expose what senior officials had been trying to conceal. The president cut him off before he could finish. "We expose nothing," he said. "We do our job. Move." The chief of staff left the doorway and disappeared into the corridor, carrying an order that would force the government to act against men who believed the government would never come. The president remained alone in the office as telephones began ringing beyond the closed door. He lowered himself into the chair behind his desk and looked toward the cross hanging on the wall. His grandmother had given it to him years earlier, and he had kept it because it belonged to her, not because he still believed what it represented. Now, for the first time in years, he felt as though she were watching him. The decision had already been made, but the cost of it was only beginning to move through the palace. Inside the trucks, the armed men still believed the night belonged to them. They laughed, checked their rifles, and spoke with the confidence of men who had done this before in other villages without consequence. The lead driver lit a cigarette and thought about breakfast while the convoy continued through the desert. He thought about the children waiting ahead and felt nothing. Then the radio crackled. A voice the driver did not recognize ordered the convoy to stop and wait, but he kept moving for another minute. A second voice came through, harder than the first, and repeated the command, "Stop, now." The vehicles began to slow as arguments broke out across the radios, with some men demanding that they continue and others insisting that they turn back. The lead driver kept his foot on the pedal until two helicopters appeared low against the horizon. Their lights blinked in the darkness, and their flight pattern made clear that they were not observing from a distance. They moved like a wall across the road ahead. The convoy finally stopped on the shoulder, and the men climbed out to argue beneath the circling aircraft. For 15 minutes, the radio traffic continued while the helicopters held their position. The driver had never seen a force move against them at this stage of an operation. Other villages had been entered at night, attacked, and abandoned before officials admitted that anything had happened. Now he understood that someone was watching from far beyond the desert and had moved one hand just enough to change the night. In the village, every light had already been extinguished. Father Jean had ordered the 40 families into the chapel, where the children remained silent and the mothers were quieter still. The men stood at the edge of the settlement with 3 rifles, several axes, and whatever farm tools they could carry. Some had nothing in their hands at all. One of those men was Daniel. He held an old single-shot rifle that his father had carried in another war, and he possessed only 4 bullets. Daniel counted them 3 times while watching the road. Each count ended with the same number and the same conclusion. Inside the chapel, Father Jean lit a single candle and placed it on the dirt altar. He turned toward the families and told them that whatever happened, they were not alone. His voice remained controlled, but his hands were shaking. The children watched him without moving. A girl of approximately 8 years stood near the back and asked whether the Pope was going to help them. Father Jean did not answer immediately. He forced a small smile and told her that the Pope already knew, or at least that he believed the Pope knew. The girl sat down again as her mother pulled her closer. A baby began to cry. An elderly woman started singing quietly in a language the armed men outside would not understand, and the candle continued burning above the dirt floor. Beyond the chapel walls, insects filled the darkness with sound. Underneath that sound came the distant movement of engines. Daniel saw the headlights first, but said nothing. He tightened his grip on the rifle while 2 boys carried a wooden bench from the chapel and placed it across the road. The bench could not stop a truck, and everyone understood that. It was still the only barrier they could build. Father Jean walked out of the chapel and stood beside Daniel without a weapon. He carried only a rosary, holding it tightly as he asked how many vehicles were approaching. Daniel told him that he could see more than 20 pairs of headlights. Father Jean answered that this meant more than 200 men, and Daniel quietly confirmed it. For a moment, Father Jean closed his eyes. He thought about his bishop, the Pope, and the message he had sent into the darkness without knowing whether it had reached anyone. Above him, the same stars stretched over the village, the presidential palace, and the Vatican. Below them, the engines continued drawing closer. Inside the chapel, the 8-year-old girl who had asked about the Pope leaned against her mother and listened to the silence outside. Her name was Esther. She had been baptized 2 years earlier in the next village by a priest who had since disappeared. Now she held her mother's hand and watched the candles near the altar. There had been 3 candles at first. 2 had gone out when the wind entered through the doorway, leaving only 1 flame still burning. Esther looked at it, then whispered to her mother, "If the Pope knows our names, does he know mine?" Her mother smiled through wet eyes and told her that he did. Esther asked how that was possible. Her mother answered that the Pope knew because he had asked, and that was how popes knew things now. Esther accepted the explanation without another question. She closed her eyes, not to pray, but to listen more carefully to the silence and the distant engines beyond the chapel. Father Jean returned from the road and looked across the families gathered inside. He counted them again, just as he had counted them every night during the previous week. There were 40 families, 152 people, and 61 children. He knew the number before he finished, but he counted anyway. He had memorized every name in the village, and had told no one that he had done it. In the back of his mind, he had feared that one day he might have to read those names aloud at a funeral he would not be permitted to hold. He forced the thought away before it could settle over the room. Then he reached for the rosary and closed his hand around it more tightly. What no one inside the village understood was that their names had already entered the Pope's private system of attention. In his study in Rome, a folder rested inside a drawer secured by a small brass key. Only 2 people possessed copies of that key, Pope Leo XIV and a quiet Augustinian sister who had served his predecessor. The folder was not part of the normal diplomatic machinery. Inside it were the names of villages, families, priests, sisters, catechists, and Christians, living in places where their faith could bring death. Pope Leo had begun assembling the material almost a year earlier, without informing the Secretariat of State or the Council for Interreligious Dialogue. Even some of the cardinals closest to him did not know the folder existed. He did not call it a list. He called it the Watch. It contained no theological argument and no ceremonial language. It was built from geography, vulnerability, and risk, where attacks were being prepared, which villages had no defense, which priests had stopped sending letters, and which children no longer attended school because their classrooms had been burned. Every entry represented a place where silence could become fatal. Each Friday night, before trying to sleep, the Pope opened the folder and read the names aloud. Sometimes he added a new one in his own handwriting. Sometimes he crossed one out. The crossed-out names did not mark the people who had been saved. He identified those names by the dates beside them. Each year, when those dates returned, he prayed for the dead again. The record did not allow him to convert loss into a statistic or move past it through official language. Every line remained attached to a person, a village, and a day when protection had arrived too late. That Friday, Pope Leo had spent an hour reading the folder. He stayed awake beyond his normal time because the warnings from West Africa had become more precise. He did not describe the feeling as intuition. He called it experience. For 2 weeks, a bishop in the region had been sending him quiet messages. Armed men were gathering, the bishop warned, and they would move soon, although no one yet knew which village had been selected. Pope Leo read each report and refused to wait for the final confirmation. By the time the attackers chose their road, he had already been preparing for 3 weeks. He contacted two ambassadors through private numbers and asked them, almost casually, to pay attention if they heard anything unusual. He moved a small amount of Vatican money to a Catholic organization working in the region. He also sent a personal sealed letter, designed to leave no public trail, to a man he trusted in the national capital. Each action appeared separate, but together they created a network that could move faster than formal diplomacy. By the time Father Jean's radio warning crossed two countries and reached Rome, 3 nations were already watching the region. That had not happened by accident. The Pope had built the arrangement quietly over several weeks, before anyone knew which community would need it. The call to the President was not the beginning of the response, but the final pressure applied to a system already in place. Many cardinals would have called the Operation Interference. Some would have described it as political, and a few would have used language harsher than either word. Pope Leo was prepared for that confrontation. He cared more about a village he had never visited, a priest he had never met, and a child whose name had not yet reached the folder. To him, the purpose of the papacy was not exhausted by statements issued after the dead had been counted. The Church had enough information to see danger forming before an attack, and he believed that knowledge created responsibility. On that Friday night, the watch became more than a private act of remembrance. It became an instrument of intervention. Inside the presidential system, the order began moving before the village understood that anything had changed. A presidential aide was awakened at 1:11 in the morning local time. By 1:30, an order had been signed, and by 1:55, 2 helicopters were lifting from a military base 60 kilometers from the village. At 2:40, soldiers reached the road outside the settlement and took up positions across the route. They did not fire. They blocked the road and waited while the convoy halted approximately 2 kilometers from the village. The armed men had been told that the army would not come and that no one would notice what happened beyond the desert. The appearance of soldiers and helicopters destroyed both assumptions at once. A radio argument began between the convoy and the military position. One commander from the armed group issued a threat, but the officer facing him answered without raising his voice. He warned that if the trucks continued, the attack would become an international incident by morning. The words changed the calculation immediately. The commander demanded to know who had given the order. The officer answered that it had come from the office of the president. A long silence followed before the commander said that such an order could not be real. The officer gave him the only answer that mattered. It is, turn around. The trucks began to move. One after another, they turned away from the blocked road and disappeared back into the darkness. By 4 in the morning local time, the road was quiet. By dawn, government soldiers were patrolling the edges of the village. At 7 in the morning, the president's office released a brief public statement. It said only that security operations had successfully prevented an incident in the eastern region. The statement did not name the village, mention Christians, or acknowledge the Pope's involvement. It was written to resemble routine government work because Pope Leo had asked the president to avoid headlines, save the people, and allow the story to die. Inside the chapel, the families still did not know exactly what had happened beyond the walls. They heard helicopters in the distance, then a long silence, followed by the sound of engines moving away. Daniel ran through the doorway, crying and laughing at the same time. He repeated that the trucks were turning around. Father Jean dropped to his knees without speaking. The children began to cry, but fear was no longer controlling the room. The mothers started singing, and the elderly woman who had been singing in her own language stopped for a moment, listened to the others, then began again with greater force. The last candle on the altar continued to burn. By dawn, the village started moving again, with the caution of people stepping onto ground they no longer trusted. The men opened the chapel doors, and the children walked into the morning light after remaining awake through the entire night. Some sat in the dust and laughed. Others stared toward the empty road where the trucks had been expected to arrive. A 12-year-old boy approached Father Jean carrying a small wooden cross broken into 2 pieces. He had gripped it so tightly during the night that it had snapped in his pocket. When he asked what had happened and whether God had done it, Father Jean answered that God had acted and that someone had listened. The boy looked at the road again, still trying to understand what had changed. Esther stood near the edge of the road and picked up a small stone. She turned it over in her hand, placed it in her pocket, and kept it as something she would carry for years. Around her, women embraced their children, doors opened across the village, and smoke began to rise from the first cooking fires. The elderly woman returned to making bread, as she had done every morning for 60 years, although her hands continued to shake. Father Jean moved slowly from house to house. He counted every family again and confirmed that no name was missing. At each doorway, he repeated the same sentence to the people standing before him. "We are still here." Saturday morning in Rome began without rest. Pope Leo XIV moved directly from the chapel to his desk because the rescue had solved only the immediate crisis. He now had to decide whether the action would remain an isolated intervention or become the beginning of a different Vatican posture. By the time the city was fully awake, he was already working on the Sunday Regina Caeli. The Regina Caeli normally followed a familiar pattern. It included a Marian prayer, a short reflection, greetings to pilgrims, and a blessing delivered from the window above St. Peter's Square. Pope Leo understood the ritual value of that structure, but he also knew that routine language would allow the institution to return to routine behavior. This Sunday could not end that way. He wrote 1 paragraph and crossed it out. He wrote another and crossed that one out as well. His secretary remained near the doorway and advised him to rest, but the Pope said that rest could wait until after the address. The secretary brought coffee, and the Pope left it untouched. He continued writing until 11 in the morning. 3 pages lay on the desk when he finally stopped, and he read them twice before tearing up 2 of them. Only 1 page remained. Within that page, only 1 paragraph carried the decision he intended to make public. 1 sentence inside that paragraph mattered more than everything around it. Pope Leo had been shaping it in his mind for weeks as the Secretariat of State delayed his attempts to create a stronger policy for persecuted Christians. He did not show the sentence to Cardinal Pietro Parolin or submit it for institutional review. He folded the page and placed it inside the inner pocket of his cassock. That evening he attended Mass and slept for 4 hours. At 5 in the morning he woke, prayed, and waited for noon. The village was alive, but the Vatican still operated under the old assumptions that had made direct action seem improper. The Pope intended to remove those assumptions in public. On Sunday morning, May 3rd, tens of thousands of pilgrims filled St. Peter's Square. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders. A choir from Brazil waited among the crowd. A delegation from Poland stood beneath the windows, and cameras faced the Apostolic Palace. At noon, the window opened, and Pope Leo stepped forward looking tired but composed. He led the Regina Caeli, greeted the pilgrims, thanked a youth choir, and blessed the sick. For several minutes, the address sounded entirely normal. Then he paused, looked down at the page, and raised his eyes toward the crowd and the cameras beyond it. The routine ended there. This morning, in a part of the world I will not name, 40 Christian families woke up in their homes. They were not supposed to. The Holy See considers their lives as much a part of the body of Christ as any of yours, and we will continue to defend them by every means available to a church that no longer waits. The crowd applauded because the words sounded forceful. Most people did not understand the institutional commitment hidden inside them. Several translators hesitated over the final phrase, while reporters in the press section exchanged uncertain looks and wrote incomplete notes. One veteran Vatican correspondent lowered his pen instead of writing. He turned to the colleague beside him and said that the Pope had just made a commitment. The colleague asked what he meant. The veteran explained that the Pope had publicly pledged the Vatican to defend persecuted Christians by every means available and had declared that the Church would no longer wait. That was not merely language, it was policy. For weeks, the Secretariat of State had resisted changing the Holy See's traditional response to persecution. The established method relied on quiet diplomacy, statements of concern, encyclicals, speeches, and symbolic visits. It did not include direct calls to heads of state, early warning networks, or immediate operational pressure. Pope Leo had demanded more and had repeatedly been told to move slowly. He had asked the Secretariat to prepare a new public position. A working group had been formed, met 3 times, and produced nothing. The delays preserved the existing system without openly refusing the Pope. By Sunday morning, Leo had decided that the institution would not receive another opportunity to postpone the decision. The phrase, "by every means available to a church that no longer waits," became the new position the moment it was spoken publicly. The cameras recorded it, the crowd witnessed it, and the world now possessed the Pope's exact words. The Vatican machinery could not remove them from the record. It would have to construct the policy, assign staff, provide funding, and defend the commitment. Pope Leo had used the Regina Caeli to accomplish what months of internal discussion had failed to produce. In one sentence, he had placed the institution behind the families whose survival had forced the issue. No council had voted, and no department had completed a memorandum. The policy existed because the Pope had said it where the entire Church could hear him. Inside the apartments behind the window, Cardinal Parolin listened while holding a copy of the prepared text. He looked down and saw that the decisive sentence was not printed on the page. Pope Leo had added it without warning. Parolin folded the paper slowly. He did not appear angry. For one brief moment, he looked relieved. A young Monsignor standing beside him asked what the Pope had done, and Parolin answered that he had bound all of them to the list. The Monsignor did not yet understand, but the machinery around him was already beginning to move. By Sunday afternoon, most reports described the address only as a moving prayer for persecuted Christians. Some journalists noticed the reference to the unnamed village and asked the Vatican press office to identify it. The official response stated only that the Holy Father would not specify the location. Pope Leo intended the village to remain protected by obscurity. By Sunday night, the language had begun producing consequences. A European foreign minister called the Vatican and asked what "every means available" meant. The substitute of the Secretariat of State answered the call personally and replied that it meant exactly what it sounded like. The ambiguity was over. A bishop in Asia sent the Pope a private letter containing the names of 11 priests being held in detention. At the bottom, he repeated the phrase, "by every means available," and underlined it. A Catholic organization in the United States announced an emergency fund within 12 hours. An African bishop celebrated Mass for the unnamed village, while a reporter in Rome searched for it and failed to find it. The Pope had protected the village from becoming a public symbol that could attract another attack. At the same time, he had made its survival the foundation of a broader policy. The public knew almost nothing about the operation. The officials, bishops, and governments who mattered understood enough. By Monday morning, the new Vatican posture had already produced another result. 3,000 kilometers from the village. Sister Mary Teresa, 63 years old, walked out of a detention cell after 11 months in custody. Her government had denied holding her, but her name appeared on page 17 of the Pope's folder, underlined twice. A guard handed her a coat and ordered her to walk straight without turning around. A bishop she had never met was waiting in a car outside and told her that the Holy Father knew where she was. 2 days later, Pope Leo XIV met her in Rome without cameras, accompanied only by one cardinal, his secretary, and the Augustinian sister who held the second key. Before Sister Mary Teresa could kiss his hand, the Pope kissed hers. He told her that her name had been on a list and that the list would not be allowed to fail. She did not fully understand the words then, but the Vatican already did. Late on Sunday evening, Pope Leo entered a small meeting room in the Apostolic Palace. Cardinal Parolin, 3 other cardinals, 2 senior secretariat officials, and the Augustinian sister were waiting as he placed the folder on the table. He told them they would protect every name inside it, and no one objected. For the next hour, they divided the names by region and assigned responsibility for each one. Cardinal Parolin opened the folder to the 3rd page and selected another village in the eastern Sahel for immediate action. By the end of the meeting, the Pope's private watch had become an institutional operation. Pope Leo then returned to his study and spent 30 minutes establishing a call with Father Jean. When the priest finally answered, the Pope told him that the village was not alone and would not be left alone again. He instructed Father Jean to tell the children that the Pope knew their names. The next morning, the Vatican press office repeated the phrase, "every means available," 3 times in a short public note. By the next general audience, 2 more villages had received protection orders, and by the following weekend, 3 detained priests had been quietly released. None of it was publicly attributed to the Vatican, and none of it needed to be. The watch was no longer the Pope's private burden. It now belonged to the Church. In the chapel near the Red Desert, Father Jean lit a candle beneath the wooden cross every night and never explained why.